Today, we are diving deep into the world of transfer pricing. When a multinational company's divisions trade with each other across borders, someone has to set the price. But what happens if tax authorities in two different countries disagree on that price? Well, things can get really messy and really expensive fast. The good news is there's a whole toolkit designed to prevent and solve these exact problems.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll get a handle on the core issue, the double taxation problem. Then, we'll look at the rules of engagement for both companies and tax authorities. After that, we'll explore the main diplomatic solution, something called MAP, and then pivot to how you can prevent these issues in the first place. And finally, we'll see what happens when all else fails, the ultimate safety net. Okay, so let's set the scene. What's the fundamental conflict here? Imagine a company makes a component in country A and sells it to its own assembly plant in country B. Country A's tax office looks at the deal and says, hey, that price was way too low. More of that profit should be taxed here. But country B's tax office says, nope, the price was perfectly fine. What's the result? The company ends up getting taxed on the very same income twice. That right there is the heart of the problem.
And believe it or not, this mess has an official name: economic double taxation. It's the technical term for when two different countries both take a tax bite out of the same income, hitting two related parts of the same company. It is the textbook definition of being caught in a financial crossfire.
And make no mistake, this isn't just a headache for one company. The OECD points out that this is a huge barrier to international trade and investment. I mean, think about it. If businesses can't get a clear picture of their tax situation, that uncertainty can pump the brakes on the entire global economy. This is exactly why a clear, comprehensive set of rules is so vital. All right, so how do we actually handle these disputes? Before we jump into the specific solutions, we need to understand the basic ground rules of the game. This is all about setting the stage and figuring out the stakes for everyone involved. One of the first, most critical questions in any dispute is who has to prove their case? And here's where it gets tricky. It actually depends on the country. In some places, the tax authority has to be the one to show, at least initially, that a company's pricing isn't at arm's length. That it's not what two unrelated companies would have agreed to. But in other countries, the shoe is on the other foot. The taxpayer has to prove their pricing is correct right from the get-go. This one difference can make things incredibly complicated. But here's the thing. No matter who technically has the burden of proof, there's this overarching principle of good faith. That means neither side can just throw out baseless accusations. Both the company and the tax authority are expected to bring a reasonable, well-supported argument to the table. And this part is key. If one country's tax authority wants to make a change, they better be ready to justify that change to their counterparts in the other country. And of course, you've got penalties. They exist for a reason, to make sure companies take all this seriously. But they come with a really important string attached. They have to be fair, and they have to be proportionate. So what does unfair actually look like? Well, the guidelines are pretty clear. It's not fair to slap a company with a massive no-fault penalty for an honest mistake. It's not fair to punish a business that genuinely tried its best to comply. And it's definitely not fair to penalize them for not using data that they couldn't possibly have had access to. The system is supposed to have checks and balances. Okay, so let's say a dispute has already happened. The audit is done, the adjustment is proposed. Now what? Well, this brings us to the main tool for solving these problems after the fact, the Mutual Agreement Procedure, or MAP. You can think of this as the diplomatic route. At its core, MAP is really just a structured negotiation between governments. It's a formal process outlined in tax treaties where the competent authorities, which is just a fancy term for the designated tax officials from each country, sit down together to hash out a solution and, hopefully, get rid of the double tax. So how does it work? It usually starts with the taxpayer raising a flag and asking for help. That request kicks off negotiations between the two countries' tax teams. Now, pay attention to that word on the slide, endeavor. The treaty says they have to try to reach an agreement. If they succeed, the other country usually makes what's called a corresponding adjustment to its tax assessment, which is what actually cancels out the double taxation. Now, while MAP is the primary tool, it's not always a walk in the park. Taxpayers run into some very real frustrations. Sometimes they're denied access to the process altogether, or domestic statutes of limitations get in the way. These cases can drag on for years. And, perhaps most frustratingly, because it's a government-to-government talk, the taxpayer isn't even in the room for the final negotiation. Fixing problems is great, but preventing them from ever happening, that's even better. So let's shift gears and talk about the proactive tools in the system, the ones designed to get ahead of disputes before they even begin. This is a really important change in mindset. The international tax framework isn't just a repair kit for when things break. It's also a toolkit for building things correctly in the first place. And this is where tools like safe harbors and advanced pricing arrangements come into play. They're all about getting certainty upfront. So let's compare the two big ones. On one hand, you have safe harbors. Think of these as simple, off-the-shelf pricing rules for smaller, less complicated transactions. They're easy to apply. On the other hand, you have advanced pricing arrangements, or APAs. These are for the really big, complex stuff, where a company actually negotiates its entire pricing methodology with tax authorities in advance to lock in total certainty. Now, with APAs, there's a really crucial difference you need to know about. A unilateral APA is an agreement with just one tax authority. Sure, it gives you peace of mind in that one country, but you're still exposed everywhere else. The real gold standard is a bilateral or even a multilateral APA. That's where two or more countries all get in a room and agree on the methodology beforehand. That is how you get real, bulletproof protection from double taxation. So we've talked about prevention and we've talked about negotiation, but what about those really, really tough cases where the two sides just dig in their heels? This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the last resort for when diplomacy just isn't cutting it. Remember, the MAP process only requires countries to try to reach an agreement. It doesn't actually force them to. So what happens when they hit a wall, when they're at a complete and total impasse? The taxpayer is still stuck in the middle, facing double taxation. Is that just it? Is it game over? No, it is not the end of the road. There is one final, ultimate safety net that's been built into the system for exactly these kinds of situations, and that is arbitration. Now, it's important to understand that arbitration isn't some totally separate path. It's actually an integrated part of the MAP process. When the government negotiators just can't find a solution themselves, the case can be handed over to a neutral third-party arbitrator. And that arbitrator's decision is binding, which guarantees there will be a final resolution. So, what kicks this process off? There's a timeline. If the authorities can't reach a deal within 2 years from when the case was first presented, the taxpayer then has the right to formally request that the dispute be sent to arbitration. It's a powerful tool to stop cases from just languishing in limbo forever. You can really see the power that arbitration brings to the system. First, it guarantees that a resolution is always possible, no more dead ends. Second, the final decision is binding on both governments, so they have to accept it. And third, and this might be the most interesting part, the simple threat of arbitration actually pushes countries to try harder to solve cases during the MAP process just so they can avoid it. So when you look at the whole picture, from good faith principles and MAP negotiations, all the way to proactive APAs and the final backstop of arbitration, you see a really comprehensive global effort to build a fair and predictable system. But as global business gets faster and more complex every single day, the big question remains, will these administrative approaches be quick enough and flexible enough to actually keep up?